Hello viewers, welcome to week 4, lecture 2 of Swayam course on 20th century literary criticism and theory part 1. I am Ashish Kumar Pathak, assistant professor, Department of English, Banaras Hindu University. In this lecture, I am going to talk about Russian formalism and their approach to prose fiction. As we have seen earlier, that how these Russian formalists, in their approach towards poetry, they concern themselves with the structures of the text. They are talking about various devices which go into the making of literary text and how by analyzing those devices and various effects produced by those devices on the work of art, such as defamiliarization, foregrounding of the aesthetic function. So how they are concerned with all those views. So far as their approach to prose fiction is concerned, it is not very different from their previous approach, right? So as we see that these Russian formalists, they are not concerned with the phonetic content of literary structures, rather they are concerned with the phonemic of literary structure. Phonemic, what we mean? Various devices, various small units which go into the making of a literary text, right? They are unanimous in their view, and in this way they are very much like symbolists. They believe that an artwork is autonomous, it is self-determining, and it is a continuous human activity, right? For example, Shlowatsky says that art was always free of life and its color never reflected the color of the flag which waved over the fortress of the city, right? So here we find that how they are dissociating art from all its extra literary dimensions, right? For these Russian formalists, structural principle, they say the forms of art are explainable by the laws of art. So in this way, they are concerned with the how of literature, not with the what of literature, right? So for example, they say that poetry is not made of poetic subjects. It is made out of poetic words, right? For example, Roman Jakobson uses the phrase moments of frustrated anticipation to designate the deviation from the norm of metrical rules in actual poetic compositions. He says that by frustrating through deviations, the poet defamiliarizes as well as enlivens the metrical form, right? For example, they say that how these poetic devices, they serve to frustrate the anticipated order of the text, right? For example, in normal discourse of language, what happens? A rhythm or rhyme will fall on where it is expected to fall. But when we are talking about a poetic text, right? So there, this anticipation, this expectation that the rhyme or rhythm will fall at its right place, it is frustrated. And defamiliarization is caused by that, and that is primarily the part of the poet, right? So that is what he says, that poetry is organized violence on ordinary speech. Jakobson at one place says that poeticity is like oil in cooking. You cannot have it on its own, but when it is used with other food, it is more than mere addition. It changes the taste of the food to the extent that some dishes no longer appear to have any connection with their oilless counterparts, right? The most significant achievement of Roman Jakobson is this distinction between metaphor and metonymy. In fact, this distinction between metaphor and metonymy was first suggested by Victor Shlowatsky in his essay Art as Technique that he wrote in 1917, but Roman Jakobson has elaborated it in detail, right? In this way, with the help of distinction between metaphor and metonymy, Russian formalists, they distinguish between technique which is peculiar to poetry and technique which is peculiar to prose fiction. For example, they say that poetry uses similarity-based devices, right? So repetition is one effect that is achieved, that is a necessary condition for any poetic work, and to establish that repetition, a poetic work uses similarity-based devices. They could be metaphors, they could be similes, even words, if you look at their rhyme schemes, so they are rhyming same. Therefore, they have been kept in a particular order to generate repetition and thereby to generate rhythm or rhyme in poetry, right? So far as prose is concerned, prose uses contiguity-based devices, right? They do not use similarity-based devices, rather they use contiguity-based devices. A kind of associative, relationship is there among elements. And in this way, if metaphor is a similarity-based devices, and so is rhythm. So if rhythm is the main source of defamiliarization in poetry, plot construction is the chief source of defamiliarization in a prose narrative, right? So the Russian formalists shifted the emphasis from imagery to rhythm in the study of poetry and advance a systematic account of the structure of the novel, right? So in this way, these Russian formalists, they find a parallel between the structure of poetry and the structure of novel, right? He goes on to say that what ordinary language is to poetic speech, right? Story is to plot. So the way poetic language disrupts the order of the ordinary language, similarly, plot disrupts the order of the story, and in this way, literariness is generated, right? At one place, M.A.K. Halliday, who has written on Russian formalists, he says that poetry as well as novel, they foreground the technique. What cannot be expressed statistically is foregrounding, right? In his book, The Problem of Poetic Language, Yuri Tenyanov has used the term structure for versification. And we can go a step further to say that plot is to novel as versification is to poetry. Further, in his celebrated essay on plot construction, the connection between devices of usage, construction and general stylistic devices, Victor Shklovsky argues that the plot of prose literature is the counterpart of rhythm in poetry. They talk about a staircase construction and constant retardation. For example, this analogy of staircase or retardation is very helpful in understanding the nature of structure of prose narrative. For example, if we look at a staircase construction, which is circular in nature, which is spiral in nature, so they say that these repetitive devices, they perform the same function of spirality in that staircase construction, as those spiral stairs do in that staircase construction. So Shklovsky observes that repetition, together with its special case, rhyme, pertains to the staircase construction, as do tautology, tautological parallelism, psychological parallelism, retardation, epic repetitions, narrative, rituals, and many other usage devices. So here we find that how Shklovsky argues that Russian poetry is especially rich in repetitions and which take on different form. For example, look at the lines of a poem which are given below. The sable foreign, of the foreign sable long-eared, of the long-eared sable downy. If we simply look at these three lines, we find that how the repetition of word is remarkable for various things. Not only certain words, certain names of objects have been repeated, but also certain same meaning words have been repeated, certain prepositions have been repeated, right? For example, sable has been used in all the 3 lines, right? Foreign has been used in 2 consecutive lines. Of has been used twice. Long-eared has been used twice, though their placement is changing. So in this way, we find that, for these Russian formalists, how this repetition is the crux of attaining literariness or generating literariness in a work of art, whether it is poetry or prose fiction. For example, Victor Shklovsky, in his study of The Rooster and the Hen, that is a fairy tale, he demonstrates in that short story that how same question has been asked in different way, and even answers are same at many times. So, what is the function of these questions being same time and again, or answers being same in that way? So, in this way, it is causing a kind of repetition. This repetition causes this delay in perception, right? And in this way, this delay in perception, it helps a reader to stand and stare and to look at the things, because the purpose of defamiliarization is to stay and stare, right? So that is how they are talking about that. Further, Shklovsky says that motifs play the same role in prose fiction as rhythm or rhyme scheme play in poetry. For example, out of permutation and combinations of these motifs, a plot is constructed, a prose narrative is constructed, right? So, distinguishing between plot and story, they say that plot is an aesthetically oriented structure, right? Plot is something unique which is made out of a simply given story. So, the difference between plot and story is that, a story is a sequential arrangement of events in a story. It is a chronological arrangement of events in a story, while the plot disrupts that arrangement, and in this way, it is unique because of its disruption of events in story. Later on in the next lecture, we will be talking about story and plot in detail. Right, so Russian formalists say that a story aims at information, whereas a plot aims at rendering aesthetic pleasure. A plot is not concerned with rendering meaning. As we have seen that how these Russian formalists, they are quite indifferent to the status of meaning, especially in poetry. But so far as prose narrative is concerned, they think that meaning is inevitable. When we are talking about various themes, which are related to motifs, so somehow these themes are bound to have some meaning. And in prose narrative, the question of meaning is there, though it is always subordinated to the question of form, right? So the question of content and meaning related to it is subordinated to the question of form. However, in case of poetry, they are quite indifferent to meaning. You can say that in this way, they are anti-hermeneutics. They are not going to talk about how meaning is generated in poetry. They are only interested in how a poetry is structured. What are the devices which go into the making of the structure of a poem, right? And in this way, they are anticipating structuralism, post-structuralism, and many other theories. We'll be talking about that relationship in detail in subsequent lectures, right? They say that whether it is a poetic narrative or prose narrative, the outcome is always defamiliarization, and the purpose of defamiliarization is to have a kind of perception of these things. Now, they say that we do not see things, we only recognize things. So, the purpose of using devices in literature is to make us see things instead of recognizing it. So, in this way, they come to the concept of automatization as well, that how art removes objects from the automatic perception, how art impedes perception, right? And Shklovsky gives a lot of examples from writers like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. He says that, how Tolstoy has defamiliarized a wide range of objects and perceptions such as flogging, war, dogmas and rituals, drawing rooms and theaters. For example, Tolstoy defamiliarizes flogging by describing it as to strip people who have broken the law, to haul them to the floor and to rap on their bottoms with switches, to lash about on their naked buttocks, right? So that is how he has defamiliarized flogging. Simply using the word, the way we understand its meaning, he makes us to see that how a person who has broken the rule, how he has been pushed on the floor and how he has been left naked and then beaten on his naked body. Right? So it is something that makes us see things instead of simply making an abstract meaning of the word flogging. Similarly, in Gogol's short story Christmas Eve, there we find that how a lover is having a look at his beloved who is decorated, and the way he is looking at the arms of his beloved, at the neck of his beloved, or various ornaments that she has worn, the way he inquires about them as if, he is seeing it for the first time. So this is what art makes by defamiliarization, right? And this thematic defamiliarization is the subject of Victor Shklovsky's essay on Laurence Sterne's Tristram Shandy, right? So Boris Tomaszewski also writes an essay called Thematics, where they talk about these elements in a work of art. For example, in the essay, Sterne's Tristram Shandy and the Theory of the Novel, Shklovsky uses the novel as a springboard to set forth his theory of novel. He argues that the subject matter of the novel is the awareness of form, and goes on to demonstrate how a story is transformed into a plot through the employment of various literary devices such as time shifts, digressions, decorous conversations, erotic defamiliarization, a second parallel story, or the technique of discovered manuscripts, right? So in this way we find that how there are many digressions in the novel which complicate the story and reveal traits of characters as well as draw attention to the technique of the novel. So this violation of the norms of story, the linear causal arrangement of motive which go into the making of plot, foreground technique and call attention to the form of the novel, right? So for example, in the novel Tristram Shandy, we find that how the father of Tristram Shandy is very concerned about the broken nose of his son, right? He gets to hear this news and he is thinking about that. In that way, the way he has been described, lying on a sofa, his hands in a particular position, his forehead in a particular position, and then his posture and gesture of thinking. When we look at this thing, there we find that how, this description of things, it impedes narration, it stops us at that moment and perceive things. And this is called how laying bare of technique, that we'll be talking about in detail. That is how art is not concealing its technique, but rather laying it bare, keeping it on a display. So in this way, this contradicts the classical notion of literature, which says that art should conceal its own processes. While we find that these Russian formalists, they are interested not in concealing those artistic processes, rather laying them bare, making them seen, right? For example, in his essay on thematics, Tomaszewski repeatedly highlights the importance of a theme, the effect that a given theme will have on a reader is a significant consideration in its selection. Tomaszewski writes, we can look at the spelling of Tomaszewski. Somewhere it is written T-H-O or somewhere T-O. So these variations are understood with these Russian names. We can pick up any one of them. So he writes, the theme, what is being said in a work, unites the separate elements of a work. The work as a whole has a theme, and its individual parts also have themes. Anything written in meaningful language has a theme. Right, so here we find that how these Russian formalists are not open to the charge of making language as a prison house of meaning. And when Tomaszewski observes that the more significant and long-lasting the theme, the better the guarantee of the life of the work. Here he comes closer to the new critics, right, or the Chicago critics. However, in poetry they are not concerned with theme or meaning, right. So in this way, we go ahead, and here we find that in context of plot, these Russian formalists, they talk about various kinds of motives, which go into the making of a plot. For example, bound motives. Bound motives are indispensable for a work of art. They have necessarily to be there, therefore they are called bound motives. They talk about static motives. Static motives are motives which do not change over the period of time. They remain same throughout the novel. They are called static motives. Dynamic motives. Dynamic motives are motives which are constantly changing in the novel. For example, the situation of action is constantly changing. Behavior of characters is constantly changing in a work of novel. Their thought processes are changing. So various motives which are used for that purpose, they are called dynamic motives. Similarly, they talk about free motives, right? These free motives are, not related to the structure of a work of art. Rather, these free motives are describing things. For example, description of nature, description of environment, appearance of characters, various kinds of clothes they are wearing. So all these things, they are described by using free motives. And in this way, they go on to say that how all these motives, thematic elements combined together, they create a plot, right? One can compare Tomaszewski's view of free motive with Jakobson's remark that following the path of contiguous relationship, the realistic author metanomically digresses from the plot to the atmosphere and from the characters to the setting in space and time. So free motives, they have their own role, because in a novel, if you have character, if you have a setting, if you have an action, if you have a situation, so all these things are to be described against a backdrop, against a locale, against a setting, against an atmosphere, against an environment, and how free motives help a writer in delineating those things. Similarly, these Russian formalists, they talk about various kinds of beginnings of the novel. For example, they say in a novel you may have immediate beginning, in which novel opens with basic information and things are introduced to reader immediately. There can be a delayed exposition. For example, the important information about the characters, about the action, it may be held back. Therefore, it is called delayed exposition or delayed beginning, right? For example, if we are reading about Flaubert's Madame Bovary, there we find that Madame Bovary, who happens to be the protagonist of the novel, that how her description or her appearance in the scene where she comes in front of the readers directly is held back. For a longer time, you will find that she is being discussed through other characters. So this is what we can understand as delayed exposition. Similarly, there is a transposed exposition in which the beginning and the end, somehow they are mixed together, and in this way the early and later events are transposed, right? They also talk about, like they talk about various kinds of beginnings, they talk about various kinds of ending of a novel. For example, a novel may have a simple ending. By simple ending, They mean that it may come to a logical conclusion of whatever has happened before. Or it could be a regressive, ending. Regressive ending is an ending which throws fresh light on the preceding events, the way they have happened, right? They also talk about various kinds of narrators or narration. For example, a narration can be an omniscient narration in which the author is there, like a god, he is looking at his world, he is describing the actions of things, right? Or there can be a limited narration in which, the author is not having in that position to describe everything, but through characters we come to know how action is proceeding forward, right? So this is what they are talking about. Further, these Russian formalists, they also talk about various kinds of motivation. Motivation is justification for introduction of a motive. In the subsequent chapters, we will be talking about all these things in detail. So, one could be compositional motivation, which is the justification of a motive for its contribution to the development of story. There can be a realistic motivation, which vindicates a motive for generating a realistic illusion or lifelikeness. There are artistic motivations which justify motives for the defamiliarization, which presents as novel and unusual what is old and familiar, right? So in this way, we come to know about various techniques which go into the making of a novel, right? Tomaswevsky also talks about various kinds of characterization. For example, he talks about direct characterization and indirect characterization. In direct characterization, the author may characterize the figure directly by a straightforward report. He may have other characters discuss the person in question, or he may have the character tell about himself in, say, a confession sort of thing. Similarly, indirect characterization, it also occurs frequently in novels. The character in such a case betrays himself in action or his conduct, right? There is also a characterization called mask, in which the character is not revealed directly, but through a mask. This is an important distinction. Later on, a theorist like Wayne C. Booth, who has written extensively about the art of fiction and narration, he distinguishes between telling and showing, right? So, in this way, we find that how Tomaswevsky describes mask as the development of concrete motives in harmony with the psychology of the character, right? So through the psychology of character, a character is revealed, and how the psychology is related to the external appearance of character. For example, the kind of dresses he is wearing, the kind of conversation he is choosing to do, the kind of people he is meeting. So in this way, psychology and external mask, there is a relationship between them. So Tomaswevsky also talks about static characters who do not change over a period of time, dynamic characters who change over a period of time. And of course, protagonist is a character who receives maximum amount of attention in a plot, or his emotional state is foregrounding. Right. So in this way, they are talking about characters, and they say that the protagonist is also seen in relation to other devices. A protagonist may be negative as well, but we may sympathize with the protagonist, the way his emotional state has been foregrounded. For example, the case of Macbeth. So in this way, here we see that how all devices of novel writing have been discussed by Russian formalists in detail, and this remains a singular achievement of the Russian formalists. No other critic or no other school of criticism has talked about the art of fiction, the peculiarities of fiction in that way. The way they have talking about various techniques, minute details about fiction, the credit goes to them for developing a full-fledged theory of fiction. In the next lecture, we will be talking about this distinction between story and plot and some other narrative devices in detail. So, thank you very much.